Thank you all. Thank you very much. This is my fourth lecture recently here at the Grand Lodge. This is starting to become something of a regular gig, which I really rejoice in because Catherine and the staff here at the Grand Lodge of New York have been just wonderful. They throw their doors open to me and ask me, what topic do you want to talk about? And that does not always happen wherever I go. She referenced my book, One Simple Idea, being censored in China. I was so excited because it was being published in Mandarin, and then after the fact I was told, oh yeah, the government censors took out about 38% of it, but only the boring stuff, you know. So it really gives me great pleasure to speak in a place and in a venue where I can talk about what's really foremost in my heart, which is the individual spiritual search, which is really getting somewhere in the individual spiritual search. And it's important to me, not only that so many of you are here tonight, but that you're the very people that I want to be talking to, because this is a room of seekers, and that's extremely important. And Freemasonry in its history has always provided a kind of umbrella, a kind of protection for the individual spiritual search. And I believe that's what every Freemason is ultimately engaged in. That's what every member of the Order of the Eastern Star is ultimately engaged in. And that is what we're here to do tonight. And I hope that what I say tonight will send you home with some very, very practical ideas, things that you can use. And I'm also going to speak very personally. And I'm determined to hold nothing back, because I think that you all have come out tonight, you've dedicated your time to this evening, and I appreciate that. And you're entitled to hear from me in a very blunt fashion. I don't want to be coy or conceal any aspects of the personal investment that I place in esoteric material, because this is material, I believe, that is meant to be used. Otherwise, it just winds up in a museum case somewhere as an exhibit, and it's not an exhibit. Esoteric spirituality must be reflected in the life and the experience of the individual. You have a right, I have a right, to make a demand on a spiritual system and ask, does this bring me practical results? And I think we should be very brave about that. I think we should be very plain about that. Everybody seated here in this room has something in their hearts that they want, something that's profoundly important to them. You may have a number of things. And my approach is, that's not a mistake. That's not something that needs correcting. That's not something that needs clarifying, insofar as you might ask, well, which part of me is this desire coming from? Is it my essence? Is it my personality? I think that's a dead end. I think, in fact, and as is going to be reflected in what I'm going to speak to you about tonight, if you take seriously the principle that you, the individual, are made in the image of the Creator, or as the great Hermetic dictum puts it, as above, so below. If you take that seriously, as I do, then you and I are here to create, to be productive, to be generative. Your wishes, your desires, they're sacred. They're your birthright. And I believe that the spiritual and ethical search is there to help you develop, not only as a well-rounded being, not only as a being who senses his or her oneness with others, but as a being who can bring your ideas and your wishes to life in the world. And I really mean that. I really mean that. There's a lot of different people in this room, and all of us as individuals have many different needs. Honor those needs. Don't doubt them. Don't pick them apart. They're part of your birthright as a being who's created in the image of the highest, if we take seriously the ideas that have come down to us. So that really is a wonderful way to begin tonight's discussion. Where did this idea come from? This familiar idea that the individual is made in the image of the Creator. We're told in the book of Genesis, of course, that God created man in his own image, and that's a very central idea within Western thought. But I think that that idea, as with most universal ideas, has older roots. Roots that are not always so easy to see, but roots that, if we can uncover them, we can help understand why that statement should be taken so seriously. And we can find a good, firm, solid foundation for our own search. And that brings us to the topic of tonight's lecture, which is Hermeticism. And what is Hermeticism? What is Hermeticism? Strictly speaking, Hermeticism is a magical philosophy that was written about, talked about, and practiced in the Egyptian city of Alexandria in the decades immediately following Christ. That the traditional telling, which has great value, is that when the Hellenic powers began to encroach upon ancient Egypt, Greek Egyptians came upon the Egyptian god of intellect and writing and creativity, Thoth. And the ibis-headed figure of Thoth, who is pictured in bas reliefs and in hieroglyphs as a figure with a human body and the head of an ibis, or a water bird, holding a stylus, or a writing instrument. And the ancient Egyptians venerated water birds, the ibis in particular, because they felt that water birds were creatures of every domain within the framework of nature. Sky, water, land, and that they were creatures who could transcend the material. They were creatures who crossed between worlds. When the Greeks came upon the Egyptian god Thoth, this great figure of writing and learning and intellect reminded them of their own god of writing, Hermes, or who later became Mercury. But they felt that Thoth was a figure of greater sacredness and power and depth than their own Hermes. So they referred to Thoth in some cases as the thrice greatest Hermes, the 3 times great Hermes, or Hermes Trismegistus. And there was a notion very deeply held among late ancient Egyptians that this figure of Hermes Trismegistus was not just an ethereal figure or a name given to energies, but was an actual being, was a kind of guide to the beyond, guide to the transcendent. So, in the late stages of ancient Egypt, when a great deal of Egyptian culture was centered in the city of Alexandria in, say, the 1st century AD, people began to write down in Greek certain ancient Egyptian ideas. And following a practice that was fairly typical in the ancient world, they would produce these writings, and they would put the name of the venerated figure of Hermes on these writings. The idea was that these writings were divinely inspired, and if the name of Hermes was placed on these ancient writings, that it would give them more gravity, it would give them more clout, it would give them more substance. So that's what Hermeticism was. When you hear the term Hermetic, it is a reference to the work of ancient Greek Egyptians who began writing down Egyptian oral tradition in the language of Greek. And they produced a wide range of magical tracts on different ideas ranging from astrology to alchemy to divination. But there was one central idea that animated the Hermetic writings, and it was that the individual is an extension of the divine. And as such, the individual has, as his or her birthright, with the right development, the possibility of creating as the divine created. It's the earliest iteration of this idea that the sentient being, that the individual, is him or herself created in the image of the highest. This was later incorporated into the Judeo-Christian tradition. Hermeticism has been deeply misunderstood in Western culture. It has almost been written out of Western culture. And it's like writing out the story of your own birth. It's like erasing the story of your own birth. And that's part of what I want to talk about tonight. You know, it's kind of interesting. If you go out into the world and you look for translations of some of this Hermetic literature I'm talking about, there are a couple of good ones, and I'll recommend them, and I won't fail to mention them. But not many. Not many. You would think that the literature I'm talking about, which goes to some of humanity's most primeval wisdom, would have been widely translated. We have many multiple translations of Scripture. We have many multiple translations of Plato and the Hellenic thinkers. Where are the Hermetic translations? There aren't many of them. This is getting corrected in our generation. It's slowly getting corrected, but there aren't many of them. And until we understand Hermeticism, we don't understand our own roots in the West. So I want to take a moment to talk about that. You know, I take very, very, very seriously the ideas of Afrocentrism. I think that the Afrocentrist demand on our intellectual culture has been extremely healthy and important, and I think it must continue. Because the central thesis of Afrocentrism is that Western culture is so deeply rooted in North African culture, but this is not understood, this is not acknowledged, and again, it's like walking around almost with amnesia, not really knowing who you are, where you come from, and why. Why do we walk around with some of these commonly held universal ideas that pull on us so deeply? Many of these notions of humanity's divine potential come from Hermeticism. And Hermeticism itself comes from, I believe, the most ancient Egyptian ideas, because the Hermetic writers were determined in the final stages of the Egyptian empire, before Egypt really became pretty much a military colony of Rome. They were determined to revive some of the ancient temple orders and to preserve, in Greek writing, the oral tradition of ancient Egypt. Hence, the Hermetic literature, as it's come down to us today, is a precious, precious time capsule of, I think, some of the oldest and most pristine theology from ancient Egypt. And if we don't know what's in it, we don't know ourselves. And when you do know what's in it, you may discover to your delight that your spiritual search does have something in common, however thin a thread, however frayed that thread has gotten, does have something in common with our most ancient ancestors. They're not strangers to us. They're not so far away that we can't come into some sense of concordance with what they were thinking about. Just imagine that. Imagine that. You know, to the Hermeticists writing in Alexandria, some of the ideas that they were dealing with were as ancient to them as they are to us. And they're not completely lost, but they've been neglected. And here's why. During the Western Renaissance, which was heavily based in Florence, Italy, at its start, there was a belief among scholars and translators and theologians. They almost had this intellectual instinct, and they were right, that there was some older theology, something that predated all of the known religious thought at that time. And the Renaissance mind was very focused and very passionate about this idea of finding this pristine, primeval theology, something that was older than Judaism, something that was older than Christianity, maybe even older than some of the Vedic ideas that through trade routes had become partially known in Europe. And the Renaissance mind was on fire with this. There was a belief, there was this instinctive belief, okay, that there was something older than Plato, something older than the Hellenic tradition on which these traditions were standing. And this was a good instinct because things don't just fall from the sky. You know, it's quite rare that somebody will just sit down one day and be filled with truth. We stand on the shoulders of other traditions, regardless. This is part of the human story. So there was a breakthrough in the early Renaissance mind that began, roughly speaking, in the year 1460. There was a Byzantine monk who showed up in the court, the royal court of the Florentine ruler, Cosimo de' Medici. And he had with him these ancient Greek manuscripts that were signed by the figure of Hermes. And Cosimo procured these manuscripts, and he had his court translator, Marcello Ficino, stop translating the works of Plato and instead turn his attention to translating this Hermetic literature from Greek into Latin. Latin was still the tongue, of course, that was used by learned folk during the Renaissance. And as Ficino began to translate these manuscripts, there was great excitement within learned circles, within theological circles, because there was this feeling that maybe they had finally found this pristine theology, this primeval, foundational theology. And there was an outlook expressed among Renaissance theologians that this figure, this figure of Hermes Trismegistus, who was so venerated among Greek Egyptians, this figure might have been a figure who predated all the names in the Bible, all the Judeo-Christian figures who predated Plato, that maybe this was the voice that they were looking for. And as this material was translated into Latin and began to circulate, it became hugely influential in the Renaissance. There was this idea that this literature was espousing humanity's highest possibilities, that with the right preparation and the right understanding, the individual could aspire to some higher state of mind, which in Greek was nous or overmind. Later, Ralph Waldo Emerson called it the oversoul. But there was this idea espoused in the Hermetic manuscripts, of which there were about 17 at that time, plus another dialogue, that if through proper realization, meditation, understanding of the cosmic order, you could get in touch with this higher mind, this nous, this overmind. And if you could use your own mind as a medium to transcend the earthly, the way the ibis, the water bird, can transcend the earthly and occupy all elements, you too could gain creative powers. Your thoughts could become causative. You could travel out of body. You could travel all places ethereally. The images, the mental pictures of your mind, your emotionally charged thoughts could themselves outpicture into reality. It sounds a lot like some of our contemporary spirituality. Not because there's a direct family tree, you know, these things get broken up and people forget and so on and so forth, but because You can always detect the scent trail of truth when you find, I believe, that people from vastly separated times and geographical spaces are coming around to the same ideas. I'm always looking for that. I'm always looking for that concordance. And you find it in strange ways. You find it in mysterious ways. For example, this is a bit of a tangent, so you forgive me, but different cultures, from Nordic to Vedic, are all fearful of the number 13. Isn't that a trip? Isn't that a trip? Yeah, yeah. In Vedic culture, in Hindu culture, it's supposed to be bad luck to seat 13 people at a dinner or at a banquet. And in Nordic culture, the god Loki, who's now famous from the Thor movies, the god Loki is the 13th uninvited guest at a banquet, and he creates violence and chaos. Judas Iscariot was considered the 13th man at the Last Supper. Why should Mediterranean Christian culture, Nordic culture, Hindu culture all have the heebie-jeebies over the number 13? These are ancient people separated by vast amounts of time and distance. It's curious. It's curious. A little tangent. I like the number 13. Next time you're in a hotel, take a look on the elevator bank. You won't see a 13th floor. To this very day, there are many buildings that don't include a 13th floor. Nobody wants to live on the 13th floor. I want to live on the 13th floor, but I'm alone in that. So you find interesting concordances between Hermetic expressions and some of our own contemporary expressions. I mean, there's been modern influence, of course, but the Renaissance folk were enthralled because they thought, wow, we're encountering this ancient theology from Egypt. This is foundational truth. But here is where the blindness of human thinking conceals from us ourselves, our history, our birthright, our practices. In the early 1600s, there were various backlashes against the occult renaissance that played out over the past couple of centuries. It was on the brink of the 30 Years' War, which pitted Catholic against Protestant armies. Queen Elizabeth died. Queen Elizabeth was a relatively liberal figure who protected and defended some of the Hermetic thinkers and magicians that were part of the late Renaissance. And there was a scholar named Isaac Casaubon, who was French but later lived in England. And Casaubon, in the early 1600s, did this textual analysis of the Hermetic manuscripts. And through using various tools of language analysis and looking at historical references that appeared in the manuscripts, he made the determination that these manuscripts were not from some primeval antiquity. They were actually from late antiquity, and they followed the death of Christ. And over time, I want you to listen to this very, very carefully, because this is the tragedy of human nature. This is this kind of binary thinking that we get into, and we do it to this day. Over time, because Isaac Casaubon had established, that the Hermetic writings postdated Christ, this mistaken notion took hold that these writings were somehow fraudulent, that these writings were a big disappointment, that these writings didn't fulfill the hopes that had been attached to them, that they were part of some early foundational human expression. And as time passed, from the 1600s going into the 1700s, and by the 1700s, the Hermetic literature was considered nothing but a novelty, a curiosity, a mistake, something that Renaissance folk got excited about, but that wasn't really this pristine theology. This is why we have very, very few English translations of Hermeticism today. And this was a grave, grave mistake that we've never really fully gotten away from in the West. And this is one of the reasons why I was saying I think the challenge issued by Afrocentrism is so important, because it turns us back to some of this literature. The problem is, it's insufficient to say, well, gee, because the Hermetic literature was from late antiquity, that means it's not that old, it's not that valuable, it's kind of secondary. That's not correct at all. That's not correct at all. Because the Greek scribes in Alexandria were writing down ideas that themselves possessed greatest antiquity. This has been the story of human progress. All of our key central ideas began as oral tradition, began as myth. I use the term myth with great veneration. Myth is a receptacle of truth. Began as myth, began as stories, began as characters, began as gods, began as stories that humanity told about the constellations. All of our oldest ideas were first expressed in oral tradition and later converted into written language. Now, it just so happens that the Egyptian written language of hieroglyphs was more symbolic. The Greek language, the Greek alphabet, was more expository. It's a more conventional literary form with which we are comfortable in the modern world. But the Greek Egyptians were getting these ideas from primeval antiquity. So it wasn't that the Renaissance hopes that were pinned to the Hermetic literature were wrong. And it wasn't that Isaac Casaubon was wrong. What was wrong is this either-or thinking that is this broken part of human nature, this binary thinking. If the original dating wasn't correct, then the ideas somehow must be corrupted. That's ridiculous. That's absolutely ridiculous. In fact, everything that's come down to us, from our calendars to vast reaches of our sciences, began as oral exchange and tradition. And my contention is the Hermetic literature is exactly the same. And we've never fully given credence to this literature, even though it underscores so many of our ideas. For example, well into the Renaissance era, it was believed that our solar system was geocentric. In other words, that the Earth was at the center of things. Within the Hermetic literature, you'll find statements that attest to the sun being at the center of things, heliocentric, which is an idea that didn't really start to get espoused in the Western mind until into the Enlightenment. You will find, excuse me, within our Judeo-Christian Bible, the statement, as I was starting with, that man is created in God's image. Well, you'll also find within the Hermetic literature, including a very non-traditional piece of Hermetic literature called the Emerald Tablet, which was first translated into English by Sir Isaac Newton, the statement, "True without falsehood, certain and most true. That which is above is as that which is below. As above, so below." That principle comes to us from the Hermetic literature. That's exactly what's echoed in the opening of Genesis. Exactly what's echoed. And it's profoundly exciting to me to re-encounter the Hermetic literature today, because I think it contains ideas that, as I was alluding earlier, are probably very, very close in nature to things that some of us experience in our own inner work. I think everyone in this room who is a seeker probably works with this idea or is interested in this idea of thought causation, of our thoughts possessing something that goes beyond cognition and motor skills. That's a central idea of the modern alternative spiritual search. That was true for Ralph Waldo Emerson, that was true for Madame H.P. Blavatsky, that was true for many of our Masonic forebears. The idea that the mind is kind of a medium, of communication with something higher, a great mind, an overmind, a divine influx, and that there's a very thin tissue of separation between mental and spiritual experience. And by spiritual, I mean that which is extra-physical, that which is extra-physical. That our minds are not just tools for list making and repositories of memories, sometimes repositories of repressed memories, but that our minds are instruments of creation, as is the stylus that Thoth is seen holding in his hand with his beautiful, beautiful bird head. That the written word and that the thought, the emotionally charged thought, the mental picture has within it creative possibilities, again, that go beyond the material. That our minds are tools of selection. They affect what we experience. You find that very idea within the Hermetic literature. It's amazing that humanity has not lost that universal aspiration. I could call it a universal truth, and I believe it is a universal truth, but it can only be understood as a truth in light of your own experience, in light of your own experiments. The only proof that we have on the spiritual path is our own conduct, is our own lived experience. I could refer to something as a universal truth, but it would be meaningless if it wasn't felt as such by you, by you. Now, I mentioned that there aren't many good translations of the Hermetic literature, and that's very, very true. But I want to mention to you 3 sources which I encourage you to go to. They're widely available, they're easily found. In a way, they're part of a lost history, but it's lost only because it's been neglected. But it doesn't have to be neglected. There are 2 really fine translations of the Hermetic literature. One was published in 1992 by Cambridge University Press by a man named Brian Copenhaver. It's a book called the Hermetica, which you can very easily find online. Another was published more recently by Inner Traditions, and the primary translator is a guy named Clement Salomon. There are other translators as well. They're both excellent. And if you want to take your first taste of Hermetic literature, and I really encourage you to do so, you'll be delighted and you'll be thrilled at how epic it is, but also how simple it is. Because truth comes with simplicity. When truth comes, it comes with simplicity. Are the Beatitudes complicated? Is the Sermon on the Mount complicated? No. We can't act on it. We're completely helpless. But if we're really looking for truth, it's not that complicated. And I don't like this notion that somehow ancient literature has to be translated in this turgid, impenetrable fashion with a 40-page introduction and countless notes, because it robs us of the idea that the original writers had, which was that this was meant to be experienced and read by the individual. Remember, once I published an anthology of Emerson's writings, and there was some professor somewhere who wrote to me and said, these was literally his words. I wish I were paraphrasing. He said, it is impossible to understand Emerson without historical and textual notes. It is impossible. And I thought, what would Emerson himself had said about that? Emerson used to give public talks. He was quite a shrewd businessman. As soon as he was done with it, better than me, as soon as he was done with a public talk, he would issue it as a pamphlet. I don't do anything, I just go home. And he was very shrewd about, he would give the talk, people would write about the talk, and in the newspaper the next day and say, who does this guy think he is? And then he'd issue it as a pamphlet so everybody in Boston could see what all the hubbub was about. Emerson was very interested in reaching the public, and he was very persuaded, correctly, that his ideas were completely accessible. You just had to want to experience them. People always say, Madame Blavatsky's impossible to read, G.I. Gurdjieff's impossible to read. And I have this expression, if you can go like that, they're not impossible to read. Just go like that. Keep reading. It's not impossible. So here's what I want to encourage you to do. It's one thing I want to encourage you to do. Get hold, if you would, if you feel like it, of one of these Hermetic translations. Again, one is from Cambridge University Press, Brian Copenhaver. It's very good. Another is from Inner Traditions, my press, Clement Salomon. It's also very, very good. And read books 1, read books 11, and read the dialogue with Asclepius, the dialogue with Asclepius. Books 1, book 11, and the dialogue with Asclepius. It's exquisitely easy. It'll take you 15 minutes. And when you're done, you may go, that's it? You know, where's the mysteries of the universe? But what it will do for you, and what it's done for me, is it will demonstrate to you that some of your most cherished ideas that we think of as modern spiritual ideas are connected to some of the ideas of our most ancient ancestors. And it's a wonderful feeling. It will fill you with morale to return to your search, whatever it is you're into, whether you're on the mainstream path, whether you're into chaos magic or ceremonial magic or new thought. We're all looking for the same thing, which is how to bring out from within us this transcendental aspect of life that makes us more powerful beings, that makes us the beings that we know we were born to be. And when you read this Hermetic literature, even just these slices that I'm recommending to you, you will feel correctly affirmed that this instinct that you've been walking around with probably since you've been very young, that there's more to human life than bone and marrow and cognition and motor function, is correct. And that some of our most ancient ancestors in Mother Egypt felt this and were aware of this and wrote this down. And for all the passage of time, and it's been millennia, they're not so far away from us. They're not so far away from us. So read this literature, call in sick to work tomorrow, and then go and walk through the Egyptian galleries at the Metropolitan Museum of Art and realize this is your birthright. This is not imagination. This is not just pretty stuff that, you know, should exist under a museum case. Go look at the statues of Thoth and see what they say to you. See what they say to you. And you'll realize that your search connects you with some of the earliest ideas that human beings felt were important enough to be passed on through the generations. Now, I want to talk about another source of Hermetic literature, and I know this is a book that some of you know, and I can tell you it's a book that I, several years ago, wrote off, and then I changed my mind. I changed my mind in a big way, and that is an occult book from 1908 called the Kabbalah. Some of you know the book, the Kabbalah, don't you? Yes, somebody's raising their hand in the back. And, you know, I made the mistake years ago, of writing off the Kabbalah as kind of an early 20th century occult novelty, new thought, dressed up, law of attraction, dressed up in ancient Egyptian garb. Isaac Casaubon would have approved. But I was wrong. Something, and who knows what it is, you know, sometimes I really do believe in second chances in life. I really do. And sometimes something will bring you back to an idea or back to a person or back to a relationship, and you'll say, you know what, I needed to take this journey away, and I just as validly needed to return. And in the summer of 2017, I returned to the Kabbalah. There was something about the book, and I have to admit this, because I promised you I'd be frank with you. So I have to be frank with myself as well. I'd like to give you some big fancy reason why I returned to the Kabbalah. A burning bush spoke to me. Or, you know, I had some sort of dream or vision. But I think this is really what did it, and I just got to be frank with you. You know who was into the Kabbalah? A very great comedic actor who some of you may remember. Sherman Hemsley, who played George Jefferson on The Jeffersons. That's right. He's my spiritual guide. The fact is this. In 1982, TV Guide magazine ran a profile of Sherman Hemsley, who at that time was one of the biggest stars on television. He was kind of a household name. Jefferson's was one of the most popular shows in the country for many years. And the headline said, Sherman Hemsley, you'll never guess what he believes or how he lives. That was the headline in TV Guide magazine. You'll never guess what he believes or how he lives. And the reporter got Sherman and his housemate, a man named Andre Pavan, to acknowledge to him that reading the Kabbalah was the turning point of Sherman's life. He had been a struggling actor. He had been trying to break through, naturally. And he said, one day, I discovered the man with the book, and it changed everything for me. And the reporter said to him, well, what book was it? And Sherman, in his kind of cantankerous George Jefferson mode, grumbled, I don't want to advertise any book. But Andre, his housemate, told the reporter that the book was the Kabbalah. And Sherman came to him and said, you've got to read it, man. You've got to read it. And the reporter asked Sherman, who at the time was known as being a very private guy, almost like maybe a bit of a recluse. He said, why don't you hang around at Hollywood parties and restaurants? And Sherman said, nothing goes on there. Nothing goes on there. Everything that matters goes on in the mind. And so TV Guide runs this story about him and the Kabbalah and his beliefs and his interests. And I guess I must have thought to myself, he's such a practical man. He's such a successful man. He's such an interesting man. Why did he see something in the Kabbalah that I didn't? And that must have driven me in a certain way. Again, I'd love to be telling you that, I slept inside the Great Pyramid and, some vision came to me or Hermes visited me, but I'd be lying to you. I was just impressed reading this, and I wrote about it in my book, One Simple Idea, which is a history of the New Thought movement. And I thought, here's a guy who I respect, who said to this reporter that this book, the Kabbalah, turned everything around for him in life. And I thought, maybe he saw something in it that I, in my cynicism, didn't see. So in the summer of 2017, I read the Kabbalah 5 times consecutively. 5 times consecutively. And it had a huge and overwhelming impact on me. And I write about this. I write about this online. You can find these articles. I went back, and I did a comparison of the Kabbalah with the translations of the Hermetic literature, and I've read pretty much all of them. And I found that it really is an integral echo of certain ideas from Hermeticism. And I really came to feel that the book, for all its occasionally dramatic language, is a legitimate adaptation of certain very ancient ideas. And I really encourage people to read the Kabbalah. And one of the interesting things about the book, and you'll find this is inherent in Hermeticism itself, it gives you a lot of principles and it gives you a lot of ideas, but it doesn't precisely give you the ABC of how to work them out. Because the author points out at the beginning that these ideas will be more sticky, they'll be more effective, they'll penetrate more if you work them out yourself. So for example, I want to give you guys kind of a challenge, and I issue this challenge to myself because we're not really given a set of instructions in the Kabbalah, and we're not really given a set of instructions in the Hermetic literature. But one of the most appealing ideas in the Kabbalah, and it's an idea that has its birth, it's adapted, but it has its birth in the Hermetic literature, is this concept of polarity. This idea that all of life is a kind of sliding scale, and that hot and cold are only different iterations of one another, and that this is true emotionally as well. Courage and fear, love and hate, depression and exuberance, they're just kind of on a sliding scale. And one is not different from the other so much as they just reflect differences in degree. So the question, the challenge that the book issues to us is that if, for example, you're feeling fear, you don't need to feel hopelessly trapped in that, because fear is only a separation as a matter of degree from courage. So then how do you charge your mind or charge your emotions in such a way that you can slide the scale, so to speak, from fear to courage? We're not given precise instructions. We have to work it out ourselves. But it seemed to me, for example, one thing that occurred to me several weeks ago as I was experimenting with this material is that when you're feeling in a weak state, when you're feeling in a helpless state, whatever it is that you may be going through, maybe you're experiencing fear, maybe you're experiencing depression, maybe you're experiencing anxiety, and you feel disabled by this weaker state, it seems to me that the assertion of the opposing trait in opposition to everything you may be feeling at that moment may be fundamental to sliding the scale. It may be fundamental to sliding the scale. This was an insight that the psychologist William James had in the late 19th century. And it's gotten bastardized and it's gotten simplified, but the idea is that the very adoption of the state that you wish to attain results in its manifestation. Is it true? Let me tell you about a very interesting study that was done recently at Georgetown University by a friend of mine, a professor of clinical psychiatry named Norm Rosenthal. Norm did this amazing experiment with a colleague of his where he found they had this instinct, and this is going to be difficult to believe, but they had this instinct that if you could control for outside factors, they were discovering that Botox, of all things, seemed to relieve depression. Why would that be? Why should Botox have any effect on depression? Of course, you could say, well, you know, if you feel you look better, you feel better about yourself. But if you do a control group and you allow for the fact that obviously if you get some cosmetic operation or something, there's going to usually be some upswing in mood, although it's usually quite temporary. Why should this be? And so Norm and one of his colleagues conducted an experiment with a panel of people and a control group, obviously, you know, taking into account the fact that maybe the procedure itself would lift your spirits a bit. But they found that there was a consistent and steady decline among people who experienced depression when they received Botox treatments. Why would this be if you're controlling for the results of the procedure? Why would it be? And Norm theorized that one of the things that Botox actually does clinically is it freezes the muscles in the face, on the brow, and in the jaw area that we associate with frowning or grimacing. And he thought that it's possible that if you actually freeze those muscles, it might have some trigger influence, for the better, on mood. That's what they discovered. That's their working thesis, at least. That's their working thesis. Confirms exactly what William James had observed in the late 19th century, which was that the very adoption of a mood seemed to result in the production of that mood. He took that idea very, very seriously. So it could be that Norm's Botox experiments affirm something that William James said. But of course, all this is much, 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 much older. And one of the things I've been experimenting with, and that I challenge you to experiment with as well, because when people read the Kabbalah, very often the chapter that they really focus in on is this chapter on polarity, because it's very practical. So how do you get there? How do you slide that scale? It seemed to me that the very assertion of a certain trait when you feel at your lowest point may be the trigger that reverses the scale. It's very interesting. There's all kinds of principles in there. The book is composed of 7 principles, but they're all based on this idea, this Hermetic dictum from the so-called Emerald Tablet of as above, so below, as above, so below, that we are creative beings. And yet, one of the things that's frustrated people who work with mind causation, and they're right to be frustrated by it, is there are times where things don't work. There are times where we follow the instructions and things seem not to happen. And of course, we all experience physical decline. We all die. There's never been an exception to that. And one may ask, if my mind is transcended, if as above, so below is a real and vital and true principle, then why, as the psalmist says, ye are as gods, but ye shall die as princes? Why? If the mind is transcendent, if matter is subordinate to mind, an idea you'll find in the Hermetic literature, then why do we seem to belong to these inescapable cycles of physical decline and death? And you'll find in the Hermetic literature, I think this is in the dialogue with Asclepius, the expression that there are 3 spheres of creation. There's nous, the overmind, or what we would call God, the great creator. There's nature, the cosmic framework in which we live. And then there's the individual. There's men and women. And we are each concentrically bound to the laws that are established within these orders. And it helps you understand the psalm, ye are as gods, but ye shall die as princes. We're locked within a cosmic framework that does not permit us, within our ephemeral forms, this ultimate realization. That's not available to us. But the idea is that as above, so below holds out the promise that the individual mind, if not the ephemeral forms that we are within this cosmic framework, can rise within these concentric circles and can produce things that are in concordance with this 3-tiered expression of human existence. The Hermetic literature has been helpful to me because it's helped me personally to come to terms with the limits that I also experience in my own experiments in New Thought. I do believe that mind is ultimately causative, but it's inescapable that these forms wither. It's inescapable that these forms wither. And it seems to me that our most ancient ancestors, who shared many of our concerns, were able to explain and affirm this in a way that I found very persuasive. And it kind of put me at ease in terms of some of my contradictions. I want to suggest one other thing to you. I take very seriously, as you can hear, the search of our ancient forebears. They knew a lot. They knew a great deal more about nature than we do. They lived and died by the planting cycles. They lived and died by the seasons and the calendars. Life was precarious. And their powers of observation were extraordinary. Now, they regarded Hermes not just as a metaphor, not just as a name, but they regarded Hermes as an actual being. Now, it is very common across all cultures and across all history that we, as a human species, will give names. We will personify energies. We do this all the time. Christ, Satan, Moses. Vishnu, we personify energies. And people very often make appeals to these energies. Is there invisible help in the world? Well, I believe there is. I believe there is. So I want to issue a challenge to you. And I urge you to do this in private so your friends don't think you're crazy. How do we know that our ancient ancestors in Egypt and elsewhere didn't have keener, sharper powers of observation than we? They were right about a lot of things. I'm going to get poetic for a minute. How do we know that the ancient lexicon of gods is somehow something that just belongs to a museum case from the distant past? How do we know that? I don't know that. How do we know, in fact, that the ancient gods are not lonely for human attention, of which they receive very, very little today? Busloads of kids walk through the Metropolitan Museum of Art. They look at this and that. The other day, I was there. I saw some kid leaning on a lion that was from 3,500 BC. I was like, oh my God, you're not in Starbucks, So I want to challenge you. You'll understand why I'm asking you to do this in private. I'll be crazy, so you don't have to. If you're an artist, if you're involved in commerce, whatever you do, all these things are supposed to be watched over by the figure of Hermes, who the Romans called Mercury. Why don't you say a prayer to Hermes or Mercury tonight? See what happens. Maybe there's some cherished project that you've been stalled with. Maybe you have a financial need in your life. Maybe you have an artistic need. Maybe you're suffering from depression or anxiety or whatever, and you need a break. Why don't you just try it? Why don't you just see what happens? Because our ancient forebears didn't believe that Hermes was just this name that was given to a statue or this metaphor for some group of energies. They believed all that, but they also believed that there was a personification, there was a mind, there was a presence, there was a deity. It's not very far away from how we function here in the Western world. People venerate saints. They venerate the figure of Christ. Many people have a personified idea of God. Not all. But why not try? They were right about so much. The worst thing that'll happen is you'll just think Horowitz is crazy and not come to the next lecture. But it's a risk I'm willing to take. Because I want us all to experiment together. I want us all to seek together. This is the Grand Lodge of New York. We are here to search, and I want our search to be free of boundaries and to be free of prejudices. So I issue that as a challenge to you. So I have these 3 suggestions for you to undertake. I'll reiterate, and then I'll conclude. You owe it to yourself as a seeker to take a taste of the Hermetic literature, and you can do it tonight. Get one of these 2 translations that I mentioned. Read book 1, read book 11, and read the dialogue with Asclepius. It'll take you 15 minutes, and it'll open up a whole new vista to you. You'll never stop. Read, or if you've already read, return to the Kabbalah, because it is a legitimate time capsule. It's adapted, and it has dramatic language, to be sure. My friend, the director Ronnie Thomas, who's here tonight, he and I are making a movie about the Kabbalah, and he's hiding his head now in shame. So, we're making a documentary about the Kabbalah, because it's a work that I don't think has been fully appreciated or understood. It's one of the most popular underground books in modern history, and we're going to be exploring some of the themes and more that I've been talking about. And if you're really moved, and if you're romantic like me, and willing to get a little poetic, say a prayer to Mercury, Thoth, Hermes tonight. see what happens. It's just your own personal experiment. It's one more way of reaching out to our ancient forebears and an ancient set of ideas that are millennia old, but that when we rediscover, we will be delighted to learn we're rediscovering ourselves. Thank you all very, very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.